good morning. I'm Micah Schmidt, that's Matthew Olson, Joe Billstrom, and Brendan Meyer, and we're the ControTech group. So I'll be going over the project overview. Matthew will be going over the Primavera P6 files. Joe will be going over the actual environment setup, and Brandon will be going over the challenges that we've had to overcome so far. All right, so for the project overview, ControTech is a startup company from Australia. Now they deal mostly in project management, and with the industries they usually deal with are the construction and the construction and transportation industries. So to deal with these industries, what they've had to do is they've had a previous capstone group actually create an application that allows them to take in these Microsoft project files. You want to go next slide? Sure. And actually be displayed as Gantt charts. Now, what we would like to do, and what we've been asked to do, is that we are supposed to not only be able to take in these Microsoft project files, but also Primavera P6 files. Another thing they would like us to do is be able to not just be able to view these, but also be able to make edits and change these, and be able to keep those edits when they are exported back into the original file. Our next thing is that for our team management, we've actually gone a little bit off the beaten path, and we've decided to use a couple different applications for this. We decided to use Trello as our task logging, just because a few of us have been familiar with it, and that way we are able to clearly see the different sprints and how they're supposed to be broken up, and also that they have a nice little visualization for seeing what percentage of a certain task is done or not. And then we decided to go with GitLab for the code repository, just because that's what has been given to us by ControTech. We've decided to use Discord as our informal discussion board, just because everyone here is very familiar with Discord, and it's a very quick and easy way to get a hold of people if need be. And lastly, we have the Skype for Business, which we use for our formal sponsor meeting, just because that seems to make a much more professional atmosphere. One of the big things we've had to do is documentation. We've had to write and rewrite a lot of this documentation that's been here because, so anything from the class diagram to activity diagram, all the way to just the environment setup, we've had to completely overhaul. So whoever takes this off our hands when we're done with it can easily be integrated into it. And here, we're going to have Matthew talk about some of the Primavera P6 files.
Yeah, all right. So I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of the file, what it looks like, how it's composed, stuff like that. We'll start first with the visuals. So Primavera is just another project planning application that works very similarly to Microsoft Project. It displays project planning documents in the same Gantt chart format, and it allows for scheduling, editing, and updating of tasks, and specifically for Primavera milestones, which is a different file or different task format from just a general task, which generally has a shorter duration and is dependent more on other events happening around it to get done before a milestone. And then Primavera also allows for representation of completion of events and delays or bringing up of projects and tasks if they're ahead of schedule as well. So we want to bring in those visuals as well into the web application in the future once we get the Primavera import into the web application working. So this is what Primavera looks like. You can see it's just a general spreadsheet format with a bunch of different tasks put together into different sections. So this is a little bit of what we want to try and represent in the web application, although it will be a little bit more simplified, but we just generally want to allow it to be viewed as simply as possible and allow edits and changes to be made to it. Now, the file itself is composed of a lot of different information, which is somewhat nicely organized into tables and rows, but some of the information is only separated through tabs and with different sizes of information and different lengths of text and such. It can become a really garbled mess at points, as well as some of the information in each of the rows can be encoded in a way that we can't read it just by opening and looking at the file. So some of that information is kind of lost to us, but luckily the task and milestone information is mostly intact. We just have to pull it out of the file and make sure that we can read it in the way that we want to upload it to the web application. So this is a little bit of what the file looks like just in general. This is one of the tables, and you can see how the tab-separated tables can work out pretty well, but once the sizes of each of the fields change, it gets confusing really quickly. So it gets hard to understand. Especially, you can tell here some of the information that you can't read or can't tell what it is. And a lot of that generally is stuff that we can't really deal with. So we'll be trying to pick out the pieces that we can read and use those to visualize the project file on the web application. So this is the file after we've taken the information out and parsed it. Here I've organized it more in a regular table with designated space, so you can kind of tell the rows separated from each other, and you can kind of tell the different kinds of information that are in with the tasks. So we have a lot of IDs connecting this to other parts of the project, and completion percentage. There's also rows for flag data, as well as different tags in different rows. So there's a lot of different information to work through that we're trying to pull out and get the right information from. So this is a little bit more, the most interesting part here is the task type that differentiates between just a general task and a milestone. So that's how we'll pick out the differences between those and be able to differentiate them once we upload them to the web application. There's also a tag here for if the task is complete, or if it hasn't been started, or if it's in progress. All of those things will also be used to help color code and just make more information available readily once the project is opened and viewed online, instead of kind of being hidden behind the scenes in one of these files. So now I'll have Joe talk a little bit about the environment.
Okay, so the majority of this program is done in a web application, which means it consists of 3 core components. So the first one being a database, the middle part being a back-end API written in Java, and the front end being a web app written in JavaScript, specifically in the React.js framework. So first on the database was using a system called PostgreSQL, which is a pretty popular open source database management system, and it's being hosted in the Amazon Web Services cloud. In order to actually access that production database, we had to use a tool called Docker. And now what Docker is a command line interface based container tool. And basically a container is like a very tiny, very specialized virtual machine, which its sole purpose is to spin up an environment for some specific testing purposes. So Docker has a lot of containers that it supports, but in our case, we're really only using the PostgreSQL container. This makes use of the Windows CPU Hyper-V virtualization, which is a new-ish feature that's not necessarily available in all CPUs, so it does mean that not any system can run this, which we did experience when trying to start up local debugging. And lastly, it uses something called Liquibase, which is a database equalizer. And what that means is when Docker is spun up, it connects through this Liquibase configuration, which then connects up to the production database and pulls down basically a local copy of the data. So that way, when you're working with the project locally, you can manipulate data without the fear of breaking something in production and having a whole another level of headaches. So this is just a quick screenshot of what starting up Docker would look like. So we really care about just this line right here, this Docker start IA project thing. And that's really all you have to do. You can just start that up in your favorite terminal and forget about it and minimize it and leave it to run. Once you have that portion running, you then need to set up, we did have some notable challenges. Initially, for a couple weeks, we had some problems getting a hold of the credentials, and we did not actually know that we needed to use Docker. The documentation didn't really make any mention of it, so we had to play detective and find that out a little bit. Once it was spinning, We did have to manage with some firewall and port configurations on our local machines, and we did figure out that the NDSU internet does not like when you run Docker. It doesn't like the idea of hosting some kind of a local network process. So at the current moment, it doesn't seem possible to run any of this on the NDSU campus internet. We haven't really, that hasn't been a problem yet, but we expect as we do more development in later sprints that might end up being an issue. So we'll probably have to end up doing a lot of our work off campus. Moving on to the API portion. The API is written in Java 8, and it's built and managed using something called Maven against a framework called Spring Boot. So we'll get into what all of those mean right now. This is just an example of the Spring Framework. And Spring Framework is a really nice automated way to spin up an API without having to do a lot of the nitty-gritty configuration yourself. So with that in mind, it allows us to really just focus on writing the code, and there's not a whole lot of stress in actually getting it to properly map. So all you really have to do in this first red box that we have outlined is just add this request mapping tag to basically any Java class you choose. And what that means is that when you go to the local host or wherever it's running and put in that tag, that's what you get. And this lower box just indicates that this method is going to return the application version, and sure enough, that is what it does when you go there. So one notable thing we had with this was that this is in Java 8 only. Some of us originally were using Java 9 just because Java updates roll in a lot and you update your local machine. Java 9 does not play nice with the project and does make everything break. So we had to figure that one out and actually roll back to older versions. A bit of a weird to think about challenge is that this project did come largely pre-configured by a previous team. And so what that meant was when we were trying to actually learn how this API worked and how the Spring Boot framework worked, it was almost too easy in that it did do everything for us and all the mappings for us. So now that we understand Spring a little bit better, I can really appreciate how nice it is. But at first, when we were trying to read it, it was rough to trace the paths and actually figure out why things were doing what it was they were doing. Lastly, debugging is actually by default not possible. So typically, if you're running, some code project in your favorite IDE, you can set breakpoints and you can debug that way because you actually run the project through your IDE. In the case of the API, because it's run through Maven, you don't actually run it through your IDE, you run it through a command line. And so we had to set up some various debug listeners basically through our IDEs in order to find that running process and then apply debugging on those running processes. Lastly, we have the front end, which is a JavaScript web app written in React. React is a quite popular framework that's mainly maintained by Facebook, and it's based against Node.js. And running this is actually quite simple. It's just a single command line command, although it is similar in the sense that if we wanted to debug it, we do have to set up debug listeners. We don't really have any problems with this yet, mainly because we haven't worked with it a whole lot. Since this mainly handles the front-end visual stuff, we're not really going to be dealing with this until about Sprint 4. So challenges are likely, but we haven't experienced any yet. So this is just a quick example or a screenshot of the whole thing kind of working together. So this visual is the React front end, and what this button is doing is it's simply mapping back to one of the API calls. So similar to how this would work, we have a login function that maps to that same path. And what this is doing is that when you click the login button, the React framework knows to map itself back to the API call, which then gets the data from the database, and it creates this chain reaction where you get everything that you need. And lastly, I'm going to pass over our general challenges to Brandon.
So one of the biggest challenges we have is we're all brand new to this kind of project. We haven't had any experience. And there's a lot involved, a lot of different languages. We have to know the Java, we have to learn the database, we have to learn about the Primavera file, we have to learn about this Node.js. And then the parsing the Primavera file, as it was kind of mentioned before, the biggest challenges with that is we have to figure out the different sections, what they're for, and it's sometimes a mess, and there's a bunch of just kind of random symbols here and there. And then we had to learn what all this pre-existing code does and how they all fit together. And then this project is very diverse because we're dealing with a database, with parsing files, we have to learn about this backend API, and then we have to learn about the visualization process and how they turn it into charts and stuff. And then for running the existing code, the problem we have with that is there's a lot of components. We have to get the database up and going. Then we run the backend. Then we can finally run the front end. And then we had to set up the database using Docker, which we didn't at first know we needed. And that Docker has a special requirement. You need virtualization enabled on your PC. If you don't have it, you have to go into the system BIOS and change that. And then this project is not compatible with any other version of Java except Java 8. And then the documentation was lacking in some regards, as mentioned, especially with this Docker, so we have to go through and change some of that. And then some miscellaneous kind of challenges we've experienced. Our mentor and sponsor are across the globe in Australia, so we have our meetings Thursday at 8 p.m. For him, it's the next day at 1 p.m. And then initially starting, we didn't have access to any of the credentials or the database, so we couldn't actually get our project to run. Any questions?
So one of the things I was noticing when you looked at, or when you showed some of the stuff that you have been parsing out, I didn't see start and end dates for tasks.
Yeah, those are in there. I just picked out a small sample of it, just because showing the whole thing, I mean, it's like 50 or 60 data points long. So
that's fine. It's just those are so key. I just want to make sure that they weren't.
Yeah, no, they're in there. Yeah.
And you mentioned that you were updating documentation and that you're inheriting student done things. So was the whole, how Spring works, and are you putting all that in there now so that people understand that side of it too then?
Actually, we haven't added direct documentation for the individual components, basically because you can go to the websites and read their own official documentation, but we do absolutely make mention of this is using Spring, this is using Maven, and we do have hyperlinks referring to their documentation. So yes, it's defined what it's now using, but we just link to their official documentation.
I guess in terms of going through and trying to parse the file, I'm assuming if you just remove the pieces you don't understand, it breaks things horribly. So they probably do something. What's kind of the approach you're using in order to figure out what's going on?
Right, yeah, so I'm trying to just, generally you can get bits and pieces of what things are doing based on what the header is describing it to do, what the table is about. Luckily in the task section, there's only one section really that has something that you can't really read. So we're going to try to reverse engineer what that is and work backwards, trying to determine what it is. Hopefully we can figure out that the way that it works or how it works that way, but we're not entirely sure how that will work. At the very least, we know that we can get the information out of it and upload it. Editing it and then putting it back into Primavera might be a bit more difficult because of that.
I guess just in the example you had, you kind of showed, and there were a few rows where it looks like here's all the different symbols, and then here's some whatever it is. It's probably just hex code that here's what it looks like in terms of accented letters. So it's kind of meaningless.
Yep.
Any idea what that stuff is for, or what it's doing there?
In that particular table, I could not figure out what it was. That was one of the early tables that had a lot of information and just continued down further and further. And even though it only has a few rows, that the header and the table description were long enough or in-depth enough that I could understand what it was. So that's part of the file that is a mystery to us, and it's partially because the Primavera application is so kind of shielded and guarded from working outside of it, that makes it difficult to kind of pick out what stuff is doing.
I guess, do you have a copy of Primavera then that you can use?
No, we do not.
maybe the next best thing would be, here I need half a dozen or maybe even 2 dozen different files that all have these very minor variations or kind of keep building, just so I can compare 2 of them and it's, oh, I've added this thing and suddenly this garbage appears. It must have something to do with what just happened. Otherwise, why would it be here suddenly?
Right.
Maybe that'll help you out a little bit.
I think that would be a good thing to ask. If you can say, give me one that has 2 tasks with start and end times. Then give me one that adds 2 milestones. Then give me one that has a dependency or whatever, or percent complete, or just incrementally. It would do it. Now, I didn't see a lot that's. I know there's a million things you had to learn, so I just saw the one login. But as you go from here to the end, is there kind of a planned out sequence of, because I think people they don't want the big bang, it's all going to work or it's not. They want a little bit at a time.
Right.
So doing things like, maybe the easiest thing you could do is put in milestones, because they're just single units. Then the next easiest might be just have tasks with bars. And, but have you thought about what are the sequence of things what order might you develop?
Yeah, we do have that detailed in our sprints. So sprint 2 is mainly dedicated to just parsing the file and really nothing else. Sprint 3 is now implementing that new parse information into the API and getting it into the actual database. And then sprint 4 is the visualization changes, and then lastly exporting. So yeah, the idea is we can get there stepwise so that there is at least something deliverable.
Oh, how are you dividing the work now?
How are you going to work? Start with you, go through.
So Joe and I have been really working on the database and figuring out all of that, trying to just figure out how it all runs. And since then, we've really been working with the documentation and really updating that. And so from here on out, we're going to be working with kind of back-end kind of things.
Yeah, Mike and I have taken ownership of, like you said, database and a lot of the API work, and then these guys have been working on the actual file parsing of things.
So what feedback are you getting from the Australians?
We've only been discussing with them so far, and we've been getting fairly good feedback. I mean, he understands, the kind of challenges that we've had to overcome, and so it's mostly been good.
I think that's it. He's right. We actually have not met with anyone directly from Controtech, but that's planned. We knew about that. So actually, now that Sprint 2 has ended and we have achieved some file parsing, Iman said that once we get to that part, then we will be meeting with them. So we should be expecting to talk to a representative within the next week or 2. But yeah, with Iman, feedback has been good, and yeah, he's understood that there have been some challenges and the documentation problems and stuff like that. But I'd say overall, well.
Okay. And Controtech will be.
Yes.
Have you needed to make a lot of changes to the back end, or is it mostly just you can integrate with the existing code reasonably well?
Yeah, the backend realistically should only need new column mappings and then accounting for those column mappings in the various functions. It does a pretty good job of being generic. Like it works right now with Microsoft project files, but the actual code itself is dealing with the database entries. So that's kind of the idea. You can upload any project file, and the code is able to work with that. We don't have to write brand new functions for Primavera versus a different function for Microsoft. We more just have to modify the existing function.
Okay. And then you haven't really touched any front-end stuff?
Not really, no.
Okay.
No.
Now, the way I understood this was there are some people that are going to have the expensive license, and then there's a bunch of people that want to just be able to look at these things, maybe make a little modification. My schedule's going to go out a week or whatever. Are the people doing that? What you have trouble running it on NDSU? Are those people going to have those same kind of issues? Is
I
this
don't
going to be an
think
issue?
so. The hardships we have with running have more to do with Docker, and that the network doesn't like it when you host your own kind of server. So the database like that is normally going to be in Amazon, so that shouldn't be an issue.
Okay.
If we had a database, say locally here, like if we talked to Guy and got one running, we would probably be able to do that just fine.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.